This is the third and final day of our program, High Noon at Museum. Today we're going to have two speakers, and as the day before yesterday and yesterday, I'm going to briefly introduce them, just a little bit, give you a context of their work, and I hope we will have a little bit of introduction from our guests, and then, of course, sessions on Q&A. In terms of short presentations, for those who might not be familiar with the work, Franco Berardi is a founder of the famous Radio Alice already in 1976, one of the most prominent members of Autonomia, terrorists and media activists. His work is really impressive, and for the sake of this short introduction, I will just mention that his recent books in English include The Soul and Work, From Alienation to Autonomy, or The Uprising on the Poetry and Finance, and After the Future. Richard Seymour, on another side, is a prominent leftist, lives, works, and writes in London. He's known by his Landing Storm website that he's running, am I right?
Yeah.
And including the number of his interventions in the new and old media, so to say, commenting on war on terror, neoliberalism, leftist initiatives in the Europe, in the world, and so on and so forth. His publications include The Liberal Defense of Murder, and also quite interesting book, Unhitched, the Trial of Christopher Hitchens, among the others. What we agreed is that we will start with Bifo, and basically what I think it's quite interesting, and we agreed, is to talk about his one of his books called Heroes, Mass Murder and Suicide. So basically when you read about the book as such, the Bifo asking the question, what is the relationship between capitalism and mental health? What is the relationship between capitalism and mental health in general? In his most, as critics said, unsettling book, he embarks on an exhilarating journey through philosophy, psychoanalysis, and current events, searching for the social roots of a mental malaise of our age. Of course, those who had a chance to look at the book see the case studies of the Aurora Joker killer, Andreas Baby case, American school massacres, suicidal epidemic in Korea and Japan. It is kind of the whole set of issues in Europe, sometimes contextualized under the spate of austerity and austerity suicides and so on and so forth. But what I find it very interesting is that Bifo develops the psychoanalytic insight of his friend Felix Guattari, and proposed dystopian irony as a strategy to disentangle ourselves from the deadly embrace of absolute capitalism. Bifo, please, dystopian irony as a strategy.
Well, you start from the difficult part. Huh? You know, I have the impression that the dystopian description of the world has been the best way to predict, to anticipate the transformations that we have been witnessing during the last 40, 50 years. Think to Philip Dick and to William Gibson, that kind of cyberpunk science fiction, which was so important in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, not only in the United States. And so I was a reader of Dick and Gibson, and little by little I saw that their imagination was becoming true. Now it's difficult to go on imagining an horrible future, because the horrible future is here. So the implementation, the realization, the coming true of the science fiction imagination, the technological imagination of the future, has come to reality together with the realization of the dark side of that kind of technological imagination. So I think that now we should be able to face reality with a double attitude. On one side, dystopy is a sort of dark imagination. Now we have to join a dystopian imagination with the ability to stay outside, with the ability of being autonomous. Irony, in my opinion, is not only a rhetorical figure. Irony is autonomy in language, is the ability to understand that what I am saying is not true, because nothing is true. I mean, a radical skepticism has to be our philosophical and ethical ability to face reality. I mean, if you look at reality nowadays, there is no hope. But what I know is only a small part of reality. So my perception of a no way out is only my perception. So don't worry about that. Don't believe me. This is irony.
Right. Thank you very much. For just sake of continuation of our common discussion, Richard, how you envision this issue of dark side of technology or not so dark side of technology? And when I mean that, I'm kind of very concrete. Like, for example, I had in mind the salvage as magazine. And of course, it is quite leftist. There is quite interesting things, but not only that, I would really appreciate to hear a little bit of your reflection on this, what we heard.
Well, I don't know if you saw, I was nodding along at everything he said, because particularly the idea that there's no hope, and I particularly like the idea of dystopian irony. I would say a few things about the Salvage Project, which could link it. First and foremost, our starting point is that we come out of a left that is traditionally quite boosterish. You know, we always think that the next big movement is going to take us over the hill, it's going to get us there. And, you know, after doing that a few times and experiencing a few disappointments and realizing it's just getting worse and worse and worse, and we're moving towards barbarism in Europe, Le Pen, Orban, you know, Nigel Farage, for God's sake, you realize that actually we've been coming at this all wrong. The question is not, you know, when the, you know, the messianic moment is going to come and save us, but actually how much can we salvage from what is left? And that is the project of salvage. And so we have a slogan, we have many slogans, one of which is hope is precious, it must be rationed. And that is just a caution against a sort of bad hope, a kind of hope that's invested in the idea of a solution just coming around the corner. Rather, hope has to be invested in something a little bit more cautious and long-term, which is about reconstructing things. Just a link to that, I want to talk about technology, because you mentioned this. We have to come to terms with something about the effect of social media and the internet on our ability to organize. The left, I don't know about here. I can't speak for you guys. But certainly where I come from has been traditionally very technophobic, been very backwards on the question of technology. I'll tell you the truth, the far right was much more ahead of the far left in terms of getting to grips with the promise of technology and social media. Largely because of their belief in the power of propaganda, as you can imagine. But one of the things is those sections of the left who have got to grips with technology and have learned how to use it have been effusively technophilic. So we've got this oscillation between a sort of don't want to know, stay away from the internet, it's bad kind of thing, and on the other hand, a kind of rushing madly onto the internet, do everything on the internet, and base your whole model of activism on loose networks, swarms, and so on. And we have to realize that, of course, there are many potentialities in the internet, but one of the things that we notice about social media that's linked to neoliberalism promotes the idea that essentially, it's not about individualism, it's about the enterprise, right? There is no self, there is only myriad enterprises, and you ultimately are just a series of streams of capital, human capital, cognitive capital, erotic capital, physical capital, which you can put into circulation to generate some money. And if you think about Twitter, if you think about Facebook, if you think about LinkedIn, all of these can be conceived of as various enterprises that you're engaged in. So there's a kind of way in which the current structuring of social media and online media, basically for marketing purposes, that's the way it's been devised. You know, you've got to get your retweets, you've got to get your likes. You know, has gelled with a kind of neoliberal view of the subject, which is just a very entrepreneurial view. And that tends to militate against the idea of the opportunities to use it for leftist purposes, because it doesn't promote collectivism. It doesn't promote egalitarianism. It promotes ruthless, backstabbing, vicious competitiveness. And that's the experience. So, yeah, I just want to connect those two things.
Well, no, I want to go back to the subject of the technophobia of the left, because in my opinion, this is really crucial, probably the most crucial thing if we want to understand what has happened at a certain point. I mean, when I think to technology, I essentially, of course, I think to the internet, but first of all, I think to the automation of work, the ability of machines to replace human labor. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this is an old subject in the leftist reflection, because it remounts to Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, you can throw away all of the works of Marx and say just a few pages called the fragment of machine. That is enough to understand what has happened in the second part of the 20th century. A problem is, in that text, Marx says, thanks to the machine, the technology, the accumulation of knowledge, and the creation of the general intellect that you can translate like the internet in a sense, thanks to this, the humankind will be able to replace more and more labor and to transform life into life. Right. To transform life into pleasure, solidarity, self-care, care of the others, education, culture, I mean, human life. The problem is that the left has totally forgotten. Actually, the left did not know that text until the end of the 60s in Italy, mm-hmm. and much later in other countries. So the moment in which the relation between work and capital has become particularly conflictual in the 60s and in the 70s, the left has been unable to understand that technology was the main ally of the transformation and of the liberation and of the emancipation of time from the slavery of salaried work. At that point, I think, for instance, to the unions. I think to the union miners in 1983, Arthur Scargill, this kind of heroic figure were certainly heroic, but totally unable to realize what was happening. So they defended the right to be a miner, which is hard to understand. I think that the left had to be able to to emancipate people from the necessity to go into the mine. And on the contrary, the left, and particularly the unions and the left in general, has considered technology as an enemy, as a danger, and has protected the right to work. Right to work is an expression that I consider totally crazy, totally... the problem is that we have lost that moment. And from that moment on, technology has really become a factor of destruction of life because the left has rejected it and it has become the main tool for the capitalist colonization of the mind and the capitalist colonization of time and of the world.
Mm-hmm. Richard, speaking about left, and in more concrete terms, we had a chance to discuss these days and in previous years on the Open University about issues of Podemos, Syriza. We have been discussing what is going on in the region from Maribor uprisings, then Sarajevo, Macedonia onwards, and so on and so forth. I was really kind of push you a little bit to let us know from your insight what is going on with the left in Britain. You know, it is quite interesting because in a way, I can't resist to ask just a simple second name. In a way, could be. You know? Yeah. So please, in a way, it is quite interesting developments. Even if you like in the new media, even if you like in the traditional media and so on. So how you see these left developments in Europe?
Okay, let me try and phrase this as concisely as I can. I think that Corbyn's success is a manifestation of the weakness of the left. And as counterintuitive as that might sound, I'll roughly outline. The left in Britain was defeated far worse than the left in any other European country, I think, in the 1980s. I mean, you know, somebody could correct me and give me another example, but I think, broadly speaking, that's correct. The unions were defeated far more vigorously. And here I disagree with you slightly about the miners. Scargill understood very well what was happening. It wasn't about technology. It wasn't about the environment. It was about a class offensive to destroy the fabric of trade unionism in Britain, and the effects are with us still. So what we had was a war against the militant left in the councils, the shutting down of left-wing or institutions within the state which could accommodate popular forces like the Greater London Council and so on, and essentially the neoliberalisation of the state apparatuses and the neoliberalisation of social relations at a more granular atomic level, right? By the 1990s, when Blair takes control, he no longer faces an opposition that is capable of seriously resisting anything, so that when he begins to introduce privatization, which he said he wouldn't, when he begins to introduce spending cuts, when he begins to accommodate the city and most of its demands, when he begins to cuddle up even to US imperialism, there isn't a sufficient basis or a social basis either in society or particularly in the Labour Party that is capable of resisting this. So what you have is, in Europe as a whole, there is this sort of rightward shift in social democracy, a kind of, it gravitates to what's called social liberalism, a sort of neoliberal project. In these other countries, what happens is a split in social democracy. The left wing breaks away, and you get radical left formations. In Britain, the expectations of the left had been so reduced that there was no expectation that would happen. The only person to break from Labour in the context of the big anti-war movement in 2003 was George Galloway, a kind of erratic, aleatory figure who ultimately didn't even want to break. I mean, he was driven out. So this is the reason why we've had to wait this long. We've had to wait for the right wing within the Labour Party to become so weakened by its own enervation, the enervation of its own project, its own ideological weakness. It's just totally run out of ideas. There was a time when the right wing of the Labour Party could say, you know, we're on the side of reform, we're on the side of democracy, one member, one vote, all this stuff. Nobody buys that anymore, so they've got no energy left. And then, of course, PASOKification in Scotland. They suffered PASOKification in Scotland. That was the heartland of the old Labour right. So after that election, there was an unexpected vacuum. And this repeats a pattern that's happening elsewhere. So Corbyn, who, lovely as he is, he's not a massively charismatic figure. He's not somebody who had a huge social basis, but something about the fact that he seemed to be quite on the level, an honest figure, someone who was not inside the political establishment, meant that he connected with young people who, though their ideology is shaped by neoliberalism, generally tend to incline to the left on a whole host of questions, social questions, the education question, and so on, and has mobilized those people. It's young, leftward-moving people who've driven Corbyn mania. It's very, very, very fragile. And I'll tell you something else. If Corbyn wins the next election, which is highly unlikely, but if he does, that's when his problems begin.
Okay. Yes. Having in mind that we are, due to different reasons, a bit compressed with the time, I would really appreciate knowing you and your work here from the audience, that we immediately start with the first round of the questions and interventions to get a little bit of your inputs and use the opportunity to talk with our guests. So the floor is now open for the first round. Come on. Please.
I would be interested.
Just microphone, please.
I would be interested to hear more about your view on how capitalism impacts on mental health in, I don't know, generally, or maybe in Europe, or...
Well, in the last 20 years or so, I've been... I'm not a psychoanalyst. I have not a specific formation in the field of psychopathology. But I've been living and working together with some people, first of all Félix Guattari, but many other people who have been dealing I've been working on this relation between social forms and psychological suffering. And once upon a time, the main focus of my attention, of my theory was the concept of desire of the Deleuze-Guattari generation. In the last 20 years or so, I see that the invasion of the field of human attention by accelerating flows of neurostimulation. You can translate neurostimulation by the word information. It's the same. I don't care so much about information. I don't care about so much about the content of the information. I care about the psychophysical effect of the permanent stimulation in the context of neoliberal capitalism, of competition, and of precarious labor. I mean, acceleration of the neurostimulation means that workers and people in general are more and more obliged to follow the flow of the infosphere. At the same time, they live in a condition which is a condition of growing isolation, of growing loneliness, and of growing competition. What is the effect of this? Well, go and listen to the psychiatrist. The psychiatric science has discovered practically a new pathology 20, 25 years ago, that is called panic crisis. You know, until in the past, the word panic existed. 2,000 years ago, panic was the cult of the god of totality, and every person could understand what panic means in the romantic sense of being a kind of overwhelmed by emotion and so on. But now, Panic has become something absolutely precise at the level of a sort of reaction of the conscious, sensible organism, and some investigations, some psychological investigations have discovered. I speak of something of 10 years ago already, but 10 years ago some psychiatrists said that that 15% of women working in the field of the new technology were denouncing panic crisis. It seems that panic, the symptomatology of panic, is especially relevant in the feminine, in the women part of cognitive workers. And panic is only the most interesting, in my opinion, sign of this pathologization of the relation with the infosphere. You know that in the last decades we are talking of a psychopathological context that has less and less to do with the old Freudian good neurotic framework. We deal less and less with neurosis and more with a sort of psychotic relation with the acceleration of the infosphere. Depression is the last point, the arrival point of a panic crisis, in a sense. The sensible and conscious organism leaves the relation with the infosphere in such a disturbing way that at a certain point the desire of relation with reality falls, and you enter in that kind of symptomatology that you call depression, and so on and so on. But the last point that I want to remind is that according to the World Health Organization, in the last 40 years, suicide has increased in the world of 60%. This is something, especially because many countries are asking doctors not to declare that a person is dead because of a suicide if it's not absolutely evident and declared by the person herself. So, you know, I asked myself, what is the meaning of it? What has happened in the last 40 years to transform life in such a hell that people are killing themselves more and more? And my answer is 40 years. Margaret Thatcher and the internet. This is the point. Not the internet without Margaret Thatcher.
We have two more interventions, but excuse me, we're first here and then there. So. Okay, then you can go, and then we'll get both questions, and then we will come back to the panel. Go ahead, Andrea, please.
I wanted to disagree with some of the remarks on technology, because it seems to me there's a reason why Marx left his one-line comment on the general intellect in his desk. You know, he left it to the criticism of mice, as he might have put it. And it might have occurred to him that his formulation was technologically deterministic. I mean, Marx wasn't Saint-Simon. Marx didn't talk about, industrial society, post-industrial society, and so on. So he would have, he would have seen, actually, the development of human capacities in the form of technology, science, and labor power in a dialectic and heavily conditioned by social relations of production. And I think the problem with this kind of argument, that technology escapes, the idea that technological development now escapes the law of value, which is Negri's thesis, this kind of idea that capitalism is inevitably moving towards some kind of communist outcome, that the society that we have at the moment is simply some kind of shell, and that it's simply that labor is now networked, it's informational, and it's merely now a question of our desire, an act of will, and what does Negri say, an arrow flung into the heavens. And to me, this is really, work is not uniting us, except in the general sense that Marx already realized, that there's a socialization of productive forces within the form of private appropriation. We are also being divided by work. And actually, that is our main, that is one of our main problems. Without abusing the microphone too much, I would say that the left, you're quite wrong, the left has always had a romance of technology, from the utopian socialists, but for example, look at Stalinism with development of the productive forces, its modernism. For example, the White Sea Canal where hundreds of thousands of slaves virtually died building it, had no economic rationale. Victor Serge, in one of his novels, actually offers a semi-Foucauldian analysis of an apparatus of power knowledge being deployed. You can talk about Wilson as a white heat of technology in Britain, which is also a way of mastering the trade unions. Mitterrand and the Minitel, which was an attempt at an information network which failed hilariously because it was a centralized network, like almost very French. But that was also connected with neoliberalism. And the difference about the internet is it's decentralized. And I think this is what Richard's Richard alludes to, but there wasn't that moment. Because the problem is that the left wants to control documents. It wants to control the debate. And this is why the internet is threatening. But I don't agree that the technology itself produces the outcomes. This is why, again, I don't think you're right about the neoliberal ideology. It's our failure to do anything other than passively use Facebook that's our problem.
Thank you. Can we hear one more intervention, and then I will give it back the floor to you.
So thank you very much. I want to follow up on something, Bifo, that you were talking a lot about last night, which was the need for solidarity and friendship. And this is something I'm curious about, because a lot of the examples about the pessimism of the possibility for solidarity and friendship were taken from the media. And I'm wondering if we might focus in on ourselves. Some of the least solidaristic and friendship-based relations that I've seen are between activists. And it's so depressing, because these are the few people, relatively speaking, that would like to change something, and there's broad agreement often on general end goals, and yet such tearing down. I'm wondering, Bifo, from your example, and maybe also Richard from yours as well, what are some examples that you can take from your own experience about how to overcome those things that would tear us apart from one another?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Richard, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. I'll be brief. Two things. First of all, I agree essentially that the problem is not the technology itself, but in how it's used. Of course, the technology comes to us under the dominance of the capitalist mode of production, and it's structured in a particular way. And so the left has to be very careful about how we capitalize on the opportunities made available by the internet. But I want to connect this to your question about solidarity and friendship, because I am one of the refugees from the British SWP, you know, when they covered up rape and everything, and we left, and we tried to form our own organization that turned into a sort of Lord of the Flies style cult. And part of this was structured around how the internet was used. And I'm afraid that where the internet, where Facebook groups, where email groups and so on become a substitute for any real solidaristic contact, for any real face-to-face contact, for example, for any other form of interaction, what you do get is a really toxic and poisonous relationship. And I will say why I think this is. I particularly think this is true of social media. I think they're structured around narcissism. I think they have to be. They are marketing platforms. That's what they're designed for. And the reason why they have a like button on Facebook, if you want to go back back and look into the history of this, it was modeled on the website Hot or Not. Do you remember that? Hot or Not? Okay, some of you remember that. So the rest of you just don't want to be incriminated. But Hot or Not was a website where you rated people based on whether they were hot or not. And then, you know, you had a period on Facebook where you were asked to rate people's profile pictures. So it was always based on narcissism. And the whole question of having a like button is the sort of the acceptable substitute for ratings from 1 to 10. So essentially, what we now have is Facebook where if you post a political opinion and you're disagreed with, this can become a threat to who you are. So it does become very toxic very, very quickly. And I think this is true of sort of Twitter spats as well. Especially, you know, there's these arguments among feminists about toxic feminism. You know, why do we tear each other to shreds? Well, of course, you can't blame technology, but I'm suggesting that the format and the protocols of the technology doesn't help. It acts on the worst tendencies that are already present in a kind of liberal, individualist and identitarian kind of politics. So I would suggest that I don't have any answers as to how we can get around this. I would suggest that we have some rebuilding to do. I mean, one thing we could do with is to start rebuilding a left, which certainly in the UK context and elsewhere seems to be in fragments.
Bifo, please.
2 or 3 points. The first one is about I mean, I don't think that you have answered to me, if I have well understood. You have answered to Tony Negri, and Tony Negri is a friend, and I think he's an important thinker, and I tend to agree with many things, almost everything he says, but on this point I totally disagree with him. Exactly on this point. The point that I define determinist immanentism. Negri, as a good Spinozian, as he is, has many times repeated, and I agree with him, that what will happen tomorrow is inscribed in the present. If you want to know about tomorrow, you have to understand what is in the present composition of labor, composition of technology, composition of knowledge, and so on. But from this kind of immanent definition or understanding of the process, he has sort of drawn the conclusion that if something good is inscribed in the present, it's going to develop in the future. This is also called accelerationism. You probably know of this new wave of thought called accelerationism. Accelerationism is essentially based on the idea that technology is essentially going to emancipate humans from slavery, so technology is good and it's developed. The acceleration of technology is going to produce an effect of liberation. It's not true, because it's forgetting essentially the crucial point of subjectivation, of the process of subjectivation. Call it as you like. I call subjectivation the ability of society, conscious organisms, called humans, to, interpret a possibility among many. What is happening now is exactly the contrary of what Negri is repeating. I think that that Negri is faking to himself. I mean, I don't think that he really thinks what he is saying. I know that he's such a generous person that he tries to persuade people that everything will be good at the end. As for the question of the relation between irony and friendship. That's a very interesting point at a philosophical level, because, you know, the concept of friendship, you remember probably the last chapter, the introduction, and also the last chapter of What is Philosophy by Deleuze and Guattari. They exactly speak of friendship, and the word friendship can be changed with many other words. They say love, they say solidarity. What is the point, the philosophical point there? They say there is no meaning. We are facing the reality of meaninglessness. And we are sort of frightened by this consciousness of the non-existence of the meaning. But we can talk together. Talking is the creation of meaning, the creationist idea that meaning is the product of walking together, of talking together. This is the essential point, in my opinion, the essential point of the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. And what irony has to do with this? So we walk together and we create with our words a bridge, which is a bridge on the abyss of the non-existence of meaning. And that bridge is what we may call philosophically meaning. But the problem is that our talk, our understanding is never infinite. It's always in context, is in a situation of uncertainty. Friendship is the beginning of the understanding, of the creation of meaning. It's not the fulfillment of it. So irony is the second part of this philosophical project. The irony is the understanding that what we know is not everything. What we know is exactly blind on the crucial point that we will understand tomorrow. Irony is essentially the understanding of the limits that are inscribed in language. You remember Wittgenstein, who says language, the word is limited by the limits of my language. The limits of my word are the limits of my language. But when he says limit, he's talking of something that has two faces, two sides. The wall, the limit of language here, and what beyond the wall? Poetry is the attempt to go beyond the limits of language. I call it irony. Irony is the philosophical style and also the existential style which always says, yes, there is no hope, but I don't know the truth. So maybe tomorrow I discover something that I don't know today.
Okay. These two questions is final.
I'd like to ask if is there such a thing as digital solidarity in the context of
Pardon?
Digital
solidarity
in the context of algorithmic control and in the context of metadata society, and how do you comment the Matteo Pasquinelli's words that he says that resistance of today should be mathematical, that new epistemic horizon is mathematical. So.
One more question there.
I have one question for Richard, which is related to the question you have asked before. I think it is very important, and I'm sorry you mentioned narcissism yourself. So my question will be about something I have perceived as well, the lack of solidarity between leftist activists. And, you know, as we always consider, I mean, the inability of the people to repress their own egos in order to work for the common good. And, you know, as usually narcissism is considered through Lash's interpretation as the offshoot of liberal democracy and capitalism. And in some sense, and I think this is really alarming and very important, so I would really like to hear your answer, there is this presupposition that once that you define yourself as a leftist, in some way you are meant to be immune to all forms of narcissist pathology. So, thank you.
Sure. Well, I would be the last person to claim to be immune from narcissism. And I think that okay, I mean, there's a serious point here. And I think the Lash's interpretation is quite useful. I think in and of itself, narcissism is just there. It's part of human psychology. It's not something that we can escape. You know, the idea that we would be narcissistically invested in our bodies, ourselves, this is just part of the way we live. It's when it becomes pathologized and when it becomes part of a problematic relationship to one another. So I just want to sort of come back to the question of capitalism and mental health. My enthusiasms are more Lacanian than Guattarian or Deleuzian. But I think that capitalism has ultimately, or for us, ultimately has a sort of childish relationship to pleasure. And in that sense, it is the enemy of desire. Right? You have a demand, and it gets met quite instantaneously, and that's what you're supposed to expect. And that conditions us in a particular way, so that you know, we don't expect to have to defer gratification. We don't expect to have to work. We don't expect to have to sacrifice ourselves to some extent in order to obtain some greater desire. In terms of if you're on the left, and you've got, you know, you've got people who are have got ego problems and they need to subordinate themselves to a movement. I would suggest that a big part of the problem is the sort of two-sided relationship of narcissism on the one hand and moralism on the other. I mean, when we treat everything as if it's about individual failings, you know, when somebody, you know, says something racist in a meeting, or when somebody has implicitly the wrong ideas, we think that, you know, people will take it as a personal attack and will respond as such, particularly if it's framed as such. Whereas what we need to frame it is in terms of the question of how do you live up to your desire? How do you win your desire? You know, you get someone who's being politicized, right? For the first time, they're being politicized, and they don't know it yet, but everything about them is being changed from head to foot. And there is a moment when you can intervene, and when you can say to them, in order to be faithful to your ultimate desire, what you really want, liberation, you need to start rethinking your ideas about gender, you need to think about race, you need to think about empire, you need to think about all of these things. That's when you can get someone to think and change. But you can't do it if you start by saying, you know, you're a bad person, you're a bigot, you've let us down. I think that sort of approach is ultimately counterproductive.
Well, I tried to answer the very, very difficult question about digital friendship and Matteo Pasquinelli. I try to be short but precise, if I can. And I start quoting another Italian philosopher whose name is Luisa Muraro. Luisa Muraro, one of the most important feminist thinkers in Italy, wrote a book about the symbolic order of the mother, where she speaks of the genesis of, let's say, she speaks about the process of signification. Signification being the genesis of the relation between a signifier and a signified. And she says, why do I call this a microphone or this a table? Actually, I don't call it a table, I call it a tavolo. And she says, because my mother told me so. My mother, and I am not interested in the biological mother, can be my uncle or the friend of Giuseppe, but it has to be a voice. The voice in the Agamben sense. Agamben in Language and Death, Agamben says the voice is the meeting point between meaning and flesh. Wonderful sentence. The voice is the point of connection of meaning and flesh. So the voice is the singularization of meaning. You can enter in the singular dimension of meaning because the voice gives you this possibility. The mother, the voice of someone that links affection and language. What's happening in our time, in the digital age? An American anthropologist called Rose Goldson, in a book published in the year 1977, the title is The Show and Tell Machine, wrote the following sentence. I remember this sentence because I read it 40 years ago, but it was so startling that I cannot forget about that. She told, no, not me, but me. She told, especially to me. Exactly. We are breeding a new generation that will learn more words from a machine than from the mother, okay? And she goes on explaining the machine she's speaking about is the television, of course, but we know that the linguistic machine is much more complicated than the television. Anyway, she is pointing an absolutely crucial concept that I better understood when eventually I read Luisa Muraro. The problem of digital technology is, digital technology in the social condition of competition, in the present social conditions. The problem is that you are entering the kingdom of meaning, of signified, not of meaning. You enter the field of signified without the singularization of the voice. That means that meaning is cancelled. Meaning is desingularized. Meaning is separated from the Deleuze-Guattari idea of the bridge, blah, 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 blah. Meaning is reduced to signified. And the relation between signified and signifier is purely operational. It's no more singular, it's no more effective, it's purely functional and operational. I know that this is a microphone because in the process of work I need to know it, I understand because of experiment, blah, 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 but I don't feel the signifying singularity, the meaning singularity of the word. The word is disconnected from the body, from the process, and the word is totally abandoned in the field of operational, economic, mathematical processes. I come to... So, well, you see, mathematical, digital friendship. Well, Facebook is the better demonstration that the present digital world, the digital technology in the present conditions of competition is incompatible with friendship, up to the point that Facebook has taught people 1 million people and more, that friendship is yes or not, click, and this is the entrance into the dimension of friendship. Friendship means nothing. It's totally disconnected from the singularity of becoming friends. Matteo Pasquinelli says that friendship has to be mathematical. You know, the mind of Pasquinelli is very complicated. I have tried to understand his mind for many years, and I think that Pasquinelli is one of the best philosophers of the coming time, but we have to read Pasquinelli always in a double sense. What does he mean with this sentence? First of all, you know, mathematics is not the enemy of mankind. Finance is the enemy of mankind, and finance is based on the brutal inscription of mathematics into the sensible organism of the human beings. So if mathematics is separated from us, it's okay. When mathematics pretends to be the organizer of our life, very bad times are beginning. So why Pasquinelli says that friendship has to be mathematical? Because he is thinking in terms of the solidarity of cognitive workers. The friendship of our time, I would say the political solidarity of the future, has to be based on the ability to deconstruct the mathematical dictatorship of finance. If we want to do that, we have to be friendly with the mathematical person. Only if we have the mathematical ability to deconstruct the mathematical dictatorship of finance, we will finally be able to rebuild a pathway of social solidarity. Pasquinelli is always right. Just you have to understand it.
Yeah. Dear friends and colleagues, thank you very much. As we promised, that would be that for this high noon. And you have been invited here for a small buffet and continuation of our discussions. And of course, you know that the program is continuing tonight in Sartre, so you are all welcome. Please just greet our friends.
Wonderful.